Dear learners, welcome back to WSE True Stories, where English learning becomes an unforgettable adventure. Today, we dive into the life of a man who was never meant to be a hero in the usual sense. He didn't lead armies, he didn't give fiery speeches, and he never sought the spotlight. In fact, he spent much of his life in silence, often buried in thought, walking alone in gardens, or sketching diagrams under candlelight. But through his quiet genius, he transformed our understanding of the universe forever. This is the story of Isaac Newton, one of the greatest minds in history. The man who discovered the laws of motion and gravity, and laid the foundation for modern science. But what many people don't know is that Newton's journey was not just filled with brilliant discoveries, it was also marked by deep loneliness, bitter rivalries, painful self-doubt, and moments of nearly giving up. This is not just a tale of equations and experiments, it's a story of resilience, of obsession for truth, and of a man who, in the solitude of his thoughts, unlocked the secrets of the cosmos. Improve your English with us today, but more than that, allow yourself to be inspired by a life that proves greatness can come from the quietest corners. Get ready for one of the most profound, most surprising, and most motivational stories you'll ever hear. Let's begin the journey. Isaac Newton was born on Christmas Day, 1642, in the small village of Woolsthorpe, England, a cold, quiet place, far from the centers of learning and influence. His birth itself was marked by fragility. He arrived prematurely, and he was so small that his mother reportedly said he could fit inside a quart mug. No one expected him to survive. But survive he did, and in ways no one could have predicted. His father, also named Isaac Newton, had died just 3 months before his birth, leaving him fatherless from the very beginning. His mother, Hannah Asko, struggled to raise him alone on a modest income from their small farm. The world around them was harsh and uncertain. England at the time was in the midst of political and religious turmoil, the English Civil War was just ending, and society was fractured. Superstition, not science, often shaped people's understanding of nature. From early on, Newton seemed different. He was not particularly strong, not especially social, and often preferred solitude. He would build small machines and draw diagrams in the dust while other children played. When he wasn't working with his hands, he was gazing out windows, watching the wind shake the trees, or silently observing the stars. But his childhood was not peaceful. At the age of 3, his mother left him behind with his grandparents to remarry. That moment, being abandoned by the only parent he knew, left a deep scar on Newton. He later wrote about his anger, jealousy, and how he often wished harm on his stepfather. The wound of abandonment would never truly heal. It may have contributed to both his incredible focus and his lifelong struggles with trust and emotional connection. Still, his intellect was undeniable. Even in his small country school, he began to stand out, not for being the most obedient student, but for his relentless curiosity. He would spend hours building sundials and water clocks, studying how shadows moved and how time could be measured. For him, the world was a puzzle, and he was determined to unlock its secrets. But that was just the beginning. An even greater challenge awaited him, the moment he would leave home, step into the world of higher learning, and begin to realize that knowledge was not only power, it was freedom. In 1661, Isaac Newton entered Trinity College at the University of Cambridge. He was 18 years old, quiet, and almost invisible among the more polished, wealthier students. He arrived not as a scholarship recipient, but as a subsizar, someone who worked in service to wealthier students in exchange for tuition. It was a humiliating position for many, yet Newton bore it with quiet pride. He wasn't there for comfort or reputation. He was there for knowledge. At Cambridge, Newton found himself at the edge of a world in transition. The ancient beliefs of Aristotle still shaped much of the curriculum, but whispers of change were in the air. Ideas from Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler, and Descartes were beginning to spread, ideas that suggested the universe was not governed by divine mystery, but by mathematical laws. These radical notions stirred something deep inside Newton. He began reading voraciously, far beyond what his instructors taught. He filled notebook after notebook with thoughts, questions, and observations. He called them questions quidem philosophicae, certain philosophical questions. These writings were no ordinary student notes. They revealed a young man already thinking beyond his time. He questioned the very foundations of knowledge. He wrote, "Plato is my friend, Aristotle is my friend, but my greatest friend is truth." For Newton, truth was not something to be inherited. It had to be earned. But even as he began to explore the laws of motion and the nature of light, the world outside the classroom changed dramatically. In 1665, a great plague swept through England. The university closed its doors. Like many others, Newton fled back to the countryside, to his family farm in Woolsthorpe. It should have been a pause in his education, a time of stillness and isolation. But it became the most productive period of his entire life. Over the next 2 years, Newton, now in his early 20s, worked in total solitude. With no professors, no libraries, no distractions, he turned his modest farm cottage into a private laboratory. And it was here, in isolation, that he made some of the most important discoveries in the history of science. He developed the fundamental principles of calculus, a new branch of mathematics that would allow future generations to describe change and motion with precision. He studied optics, conducting homemade experiments with prisms, discovering that white light was made of a spectrum of colors. And, most famously, he began to think deeply about gravity. One day, while sitting in the orchard behind his house, he watched an apple fall from a tree. It was not the first time someone had seen an apple fall, but Newton asked a different question: why? Why did it fall straight down, not sideways or upward? Was the same force that pulled the apple to the ground also responsible for holding the moon in orbit around the Earth? This single question would lead to the formulation of a theory that would explain the motion of planets, the rise and fall of tides, and the very architecture of the universe. But Newton didn't publish these ideas right away. He kept them to himself, hesitant, always doubting. And perhaps he feared something more than being wrong, he feared being misunderstood. Still, the work he produced during this quiet retreat would change the world. But as his mind soared, the world he would return to was not yet ready for the magnitude of his ideas. And Newton, already haunted by insecurity, was about to face the trials of proving himself, not just to scholars, but to the entire scientific establishment. And this time, the challenge would not be quiet. When Newton returned to Cambridge in 1667, the world had changed, and so had he. The quiet, uncertain student had transformed into a man armed with ideas that could upend centuries of thinking. He was appointed a Fellow of Trinity College and, just 2 years later, became a professor of mathematics. But for all his new authority, Newton remained deeply private. His lectures were sparsely attended. He often spoke in Latin, read directly from his notes, and showed little interest in making his ideas easy to understand. To most of his peers, he seemed brilliant, yes, but also distant, perhaps even odd. Still, his mind burned with questions. In the following years, he continued to expand his theories on light and optics. He built one of the first reflecting telescopes, a device far more effective than the traditional refracting telescopes of the time. When he presented it to the Royal Society in 1672, it was an immediate sensation. Suddenly, Newton wasn't just a name on lecture notes, he was becoming a figure of importance. Encouraged, Newton submitted a paper to the Royal Society describing his theory of light. He argued that white light was not pure, as most believed, but composed of a spectrum of colors. To prove it, he described experiments with prisms, showing how light could be split and recombined. Today, this seems obvious, but at the time, it was revolutionary. But then came the backlash. Some members of the scientific community dismissed his theory. One of them was Robert Hooke, a senior member of the Royal Society and an accomplished scientist in his own right. Hooke criticized Newton's methods and proposed that light behaved like a wave, not as particles, as Newton suggested. This criticism cut deeply. Newton had opened himself to the world, and the world had bitten back. He was furious. Instead of engaging in healthy debate, Newton withdrew. He stopped publishing for years. He barely left his chambers. His pride, already fragile, had been wounded. And beneath that wound lay a storm of insecurities, about his childhood, his social status, his need for recognition. Newton didn't just want to be right. He wanted to be acknowledged. For the next decade, he turned away from public science and buried himself in other obsessions: alchemy, biblical prophecy, ancient history. These were not side hobbies, they consumed him. He believed that hidden codes in the Bible revealed divine truths and that ancient civilizations possessed secret knowledge lost to time. To some, this might seem like a strange detour for a man of reason. But to Newton, the universe was one vast, interconnected design, and whether he searched the stars or the scriptures, he believed he was seeking the same truth. Yet despite his silence in the public scientific world, a question still haunted him: what was the force that kept the moon in orbit? What held the planets in their paths? Could there be a single law, simple, universal, that explained everything? He began to calculate in secret, scribbling equations late into the night, surrounded by candlelight and silence. He imagined not just the Earth, but the entire solar system governed by invisible rules. And slowly, an answer began to take shape. But before he could share it with the world, a new problem emerged. Another man, Edmund Halley, arrived with a question that would pull Newton back into the scientific arena. And this question would lead to one of the greatest breakthroughs in human history. It was the summer of 1684 when Edmund Halley, a respected astronomer and member of the Royal Society, paid an unannounced visit to Newton in Cambridge. Halley was known for his charm, curiosity, and adventurous spirit. He had been puzzling over a question that had baffled scientists for decades: what kind of force could keep the planets in their elliptical orbits around the Sun? Some, like Kepler, had described the patterns of planetary motion, but no one had yet explained why the planets moved the way they did. Halley suspected gravity played a role, but he needed a mathematical explanation. When Halley posed this question to Newton, expecting little more than a theory, Newton gave a stunning reply: why, surely, it must be that the force varies inversely as the square of the distance. In other words, Newton had already solved the problem in his mind years earlier, but had kept it to himself. Stunned, Halley pressed him further. Could Newton prove it? Did he have the calculations? Newton searched his papers and found the original notes, unfinished, disorganized, but brilliant. Halley, recognizing the magnitude of what Newton had discovered, urged him to write it all down properly and publish it. This would not be an easy process. Newton's mind worked in spirals, in obsessions, and in depth that most could not follow. He rewrote and expanded his theories with ferocious energy, often working for days without eating or sleeping. He isolated himself once again, this time driven not by pride, but by purpose. And in 1687, after 2 years of intense labor and with Halley's support and funding, Isaac Newton published his Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica, now known simply as the Principia. The Principia was not just a book, it was a revolution. In it, Newton laid out the 3 laws of motion, the universal law of gravitation, and a vision of the universe as a grand, ordered machine, where everything, from a falling apple to the orbits of the planets, was governed by mathematical laws. For the first time, humans could describe the motion of celestial bodies with the same precision as everyday objects. The book was dense, written in Latin, and not easy to understand. But for those who could grasp it, it changed everything. Scientists, philosophers, and even theologians were shaken. The heavens were no longer the realm of mystery, they could now be understood through reason. But as with all great breakthroughs, not everyone welcomed it. Old rivals resurfaced. Robert Hooke, still influential in the Royal Society, claimed Newton had stolen ideas, particularly the inverse square law of gravity. Newton, already sensitive to criticism, responded with fury. He wrote angry letters, demanded apologies, and began to erase Hooke from history, literally. When Hooke died in 1703 and Newton became president of the Royal Society, he made sure no portrait of Hooke remained in its archives. It was a dark mark on a brilliant legacy. Newton, for all his genius, could be vindictive, proud, and intensely controlling. Still, his achievements were undeniable. With the Principia, he had become the man who redefined the universe. Let's pause for a moment. Do you think Newton handled his rivalry with Hooke well? If you were in his position, having your life's work questioned, how would you respond? Comment below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. But the story doesn't end there. For even as Newton was celebrated, his inner world remained restless. What drove him wasn't fame. It was something deeper, something more haunting. And soon, he would leave science behind, to chase something even greater. After the publication of the Principia, Isaac Newton became a legend. Across Europe, he was praised as the man who had unlocked the heavens. Yet fame didn't ease his mind, it only deepened his solitude. At just 45 years old, Newton had already made discoveries that would shape the next 3 centuries of science. But instead of continuing down the same path, he did something few expected. He walked away from it. For reasons still debated by historians, Newton gradually withdrew from active scientific research. Some say it was because he had accomplished his goals. Others believe he had simply exhausted himself, physically and emotionally. And there are darker suggestions, too, that the bitterness from his rivalries and the weight of public scrutiny had finally worn him down. Whatever the reason, Newton turned his focus to a very different world, one of money, politics, and even espionage. In 1696, he was appointed warden of the Royal Mint, and later became its master. It may sound like a quiet administrative role, but in truth, it placed Newton at the center of one of England's most important institutions. At the time, the country was plagued by counterfeit coins, which weakened the economy and undermined public trust. Newton took this challenge seriously, more seriously than anyone had anticipated. He didn't just supervise coin production. He personally investigated counterfeiters. He gathered evidence, interviewed informants, and even disguised himself to visit taverns where criminals operated. One of the most notorious was William Chaloner, a skilled forger who had evaded justice for years. Newton built a meticulous case against him, leading to Chaloner's conviction and execution. For a man of mathematics and theory, Newton had become something else entirely, a relentless investigator, a man of the law. Yet, even as he fought crime and managed the currency, Newton never completely abandoned his deeper obsessions. Late at night, he still read scripture, still scoured ancient texts, still searched for clues in the architecture of the universe. He believed he had been chosen not just to explain nature, but to decode divine truths hidden in time. He saw no contradiction between science and faith. To him, they were parts of the same quest. He once wrote, "This most beautiful system of the sun, planets, and comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being." For Newton, every law he discovered was a reflection of the Creator's design. But his mind, so brilliant, so exacting, also came with a cost. Newton was known for sudden mood swings, paranoia, and periods of deep depression. In 1693, he suffered what many believe was a nervous breakdown. He stopped eating, slept little, and became convinced that his friends were plotting against him. He even accused John Locke, the famous philosopher, of trying to embroil him with women. Historians still debate the cause. Was it stress? Mercury poisoning from his alchemical experiments? Or was it simply the toll of genius living in isolation? What we do know is that Newton eventually recovered, and that his reputation only grew stronger. In 1703, he was elected president of the Royal Society. In 1705, he was knighted by Queen Anne, becoming Sir Isaac Newton. By then, he was not just a scientist, he was a symbol of British intellect and achievement. Yet he remained, at heart, the same man who once watched an apple fall and asked why. If you were Newton, having already changed the world through science, would you have turned to government and spiritual questions next? Or would you have continued in the laboratory? What do you think drives a genius to search in so many different directions? But Newton's story was not yet over. As the end of his life approached, the world celebrated him, but the man himself still carried unspoken regrets. And one final chapter, both majestic and haunting, was waiting. In the final decades of his life, Sir Isaac Newton held power, prestige, and a place in history few ever reach. Yet despite his knighthood, his leadership at the Royal Society, and his central role in stabilizing England's economy through the Royal Mint, something still gnawed at him. It wasn't unfinished work, it was unfinished peace. Newton had built a fortress around himself. For much of his life, he kept people at a distance. He never married. He had no known romantic relationships. His letters were often terse, sometimes cold. He had trusted few, confided in fewer. The towering achievements of his mind came at the expense of deep emotional connection. And perhaps, in moments of silence, when the halls of Cambridge or the corridors of the Mint were empty, he felt that weight. But Newton's greatest conflict in these later years wasn't personal, it was intellectual. It concerned the very legacy of science. The Enlightenment was blooming across Europe. Philosophers, scientists, and thinkers were inspired by Newton's laws and used them to argue for a purely mechanical universe. In their view, the cosmos was like a clock, wound up by some distant creator but now running on its own, without need for divine interference. But Newton disagreed. He believed that God was not just the initial spark of the universe, but a constant, active force within it. To him, the idea of a universe running independently, without divine will, was as flawed as the superstitions he had fought in his youth. In his unpublished writings, he argued fiercely against this view. He feared that people would take his mathematics and twist it into something cold, godless, and detached from meaning. In this struggle, Newton stood nearly alone. His relationships with younger thinkers, some of whom idolized him, were often strained. He could be condescending, territorial, and unwilling to admit error. He fought bitter disputes over credit for discoveries, especially with Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, the German philosopher and mathematician who had independently developed calculus around the same time as Newton. What began as a scholarly disagreement quickly turned into a vicious intellectual war. Newton accused Leibniz of plagiarism. The Royal Society, under Newton's leadership, published a report concluding Newton's priority, without revealing that Newton himself had written it. This obsession with credit, this need to be the first, the origin, the authority, consumed Newton. And it cost him friendships, reputations, and a chance to build bridges across the scientific world. But perhaps, deep down, Newton feared something greater than being second. He feared being forgotten. As age crept in, his days of discovery faded into the past. He became more symbolic than active. His mind, once ablaze with curiosity, now turned inward again, toward God, toward Scripture, and toward the looming shadow of death. And yet, even in this state, he carried himself with quiet dignity. He was seen walking through the gardens of London, his cane tapping lightly on the stone, his silver hair catching the morning sun. Children sometimes followed him, unaware that this frail old man had once redefined the heavens. Visitors still came to ask questions. Some were scientists, hoping to gain wisdom. Others were simply curious to see a living legend. He would smile, nod politely, and speak softly. But few, if any, truly knew what he was thinking. Near the end, a friend asked him how he viewed his life. Newton replied not with pride, but with humility. I do not know what I may appear to the world. But to myself, I seem to have been only like a boy playing on the seashore, now and then finding a smoother pebble or a prettier shell than ordinary, whilst the great ocean of truth lay all undiscovered before me. A boy on the seashore. Even after all he had discovered, Newton still saw himself not as a conqueror of knowledge, but as a humble seeker, staring into the vastness of the unknown. That, perhaps, is the most powerful part of his legacy. In the final years of his life, Sir Isaac Newton became an icon, admired, respected, even revered. But beyond the honors, titles, and global fame, he remained remarkably consistent in one way: his insatiable curiosity. Though he no longer wrote scientific treatises or crafted equations late into the night, he still studied, still read deeply, and still argued passionately about ideas. The fire that had once driven him to unlock the laws of motion and gravity had not gone out, it had simply grown quieter, more inward. Newton died in 1727, at the age of 84. He was buried in Westminster Abbey, a rare honor for a scientist at the time. His tomb, placed near kings and poets, marked the final resting place of a man who had changed the world through thought alone. But what exactly had he achieved? It's hard to overstate the impact of Newton's work. His Principia laid the foundation for classical mechanics, the rules that govern how objects move. His theories of gravity explained why planets orbit the sun and how tides rise and fall. His work on optics reshaped the way we understand light. His creation of calculus enabled future generations to describe change and complexity with mathematical precision. For over 200 years, Newton's laws were treated as absolute truths. They were used to build machines, predict eclipses, send ships across oceans, and even plan the movements of planets. When Albert Einstein came along in the 20th century and proposed the theory of relativity, it didn't erase Newton's ideas, it refined them. Even today, engineers launching satellites or building bridges still rely on Newtonian physics. But perhaps more importantly, Newton's legacy lies not just in what he discovered, but in how he discovered it. He showed that the universe could be understood through observation, reason, and mathematics, not just belief or tradition. He transformed science from a scattered curiosity into a systematic method for unlocking truth. In doing so, Newton helped spark the Enlightenment, a period of history that emphasized reason, evidence, and individual thought. He empowered thinkers across Europe and beyond to ask bold questions. What else can we know? What other mysteries can we solve? He also proved something deeper, that even someone from humble beginnings, a premature baby born in a remote village, abandoned by his mother, misunderstood by his peers, could rise through the power of the mind. It makes you wonder. If Newton had chosen a different path, if he had ignored that falling apple, if he had remained silent after the criticism, if he had never returned to science after his breakdown, would the world today be the same? And if one quiet, curious person could change how we understand the entire universe, what might you be capable of? Would you recognize your own potential if it looked nothing like anyone else's? Newton never chased fame. He chased truth. And in doing so, he became immortal, not by birthright or force, but by the enduring light of knowledge. The story of Isaac Newton is more than a list of scientific milestones. It is the journey of a deeply human soul, marked by brilliance, but also by pain, by extraordinary clarity, but also haunting solitude. He began life as an overlooked child, frail and abandoned, born in a time of fear and superstition. He could have remained anonymous, just another name lost to history. But instead, through sheer perseverance, relentless curiosity, and unshakable discipline, he reshaped our understanding of reality itself. His inner transformation is perhaps what makes his story so timeless. Newton didn't start as a confident genius. He was withdrawn, unsure, and plagued by self-doubt. Yet he faced these inner storms with the one weapon he trusted, thought. And through that thought, he discovered a kind of quiet power that many never find, the power of purpose, and of dedicating oneself fully to the pursuit of something greater than pride, comfort, or fear. In every moment of resistance, in every time he was dismissed, misunderstood, or criticized, Newton had a choice. He could withdraw and stay silent forever. Or he could rise again, go deeper, and return stronger. And time after time, he chose to rise. He sacrificed ease for discovery. He sacrificed popularity for principle. He even sacrificed parts of his emotional life, connection, vulnerability, and companionship for the clarity of thought. It's easy to admire his genius, but harder to understand the weight he carried in exchange for it. His legacy reminds us that progress is not always loud or glamorous. Sometimes, the most world-changing ideas are born in stillness, in silence, in the quiet persistence of someone who refuses to stop asking why. Newton gave us a universe of laws, but he also left behind something more elusive, a lesson in resilience. He taught us that you don't need perfect beginnings to create powerful endings. That brilliance doesn't always shout. Sometimes, it whispers through candlelight, through quiet mornings, through long winters alone with nothing but your thoughts and your courage. So, what is Newton's ultimate lesson? Perhaps it is this: the universe may be vast, but within each of us is a mind capable of reaching just as far, if we are willing to endure, to seek, and to trust in the power of quiet determination. Now, before we end, let me ask you, what lesson do you think can be learned from Newton's story? Is it about the nature of genius? About isolation and focus? About resilience or humility? Or did it remind you of your own moments of quiet strength? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to know how this story spoke to you. Are you ready for the emotional farewell? Dear learners, as we reach the end of today's journey, let's take a moment to reflect, not just on the life of Isaac Newton, but on what it means for all of us. We began with the story of a small, fragile boy born on Christmas Day. A boy who had every reason to disappear into the shadows of history. And yet, he became a man who defined how we see the world itself. Through trial and error, through silence and storm, Newton never stopped searching for truth, for order, for meaning. His was a life shaped by solitude, yet overflowing with insight. A life where emotional wounds never fully healed, but still gave rise to timeless brilliance. He taught us that the greatest discoveries don't always come from loud voices or crowded rooms, but from those who dare to sit alone with their questions and wait for the answers. And in that, there is hope for all of us. Because you, too, carry the seeds of greatness. Maybe not in the same form, but in your own quiet strength, your own questions, your own pursuit of learning. Every time you choose to learn something new, to think more deeply, to rise after a setback, you are honoring that same spirit. You're not just learning English today, you're strengthening the voice inside you that says, keep going. So if you ever feel like your efforts are invisible, your dreams too far, or your doubts too loud, remember Newton. Remember that even the man who explained the movement of the stars sometimes felt lost himself. And still, he pressed on. Share Newton's story with someone who needs inspiration today. Carry forward his message, that greatness can be quiet, that truth is worth seeking, and that each of us holds a universe of potential within. If this story moved you, like this video to let us know. Subscribe for more journeys like this, where language meets life, and where history becomes personal. And don't forget to leave a comment. What was one word, one phrase, or one moment that stayed with you from today's story? What will you carry forward? Until next time, keep learning, keep dreaming. Goodbye for now.